Hello, and welcome to part 2 of my episode on the history of women's soccer. Last time, we talked about the history of the sport as a whole and the largely unknown and forgotten Women's World Cups of the early 70s. If you haven't checked that one out, I suggest you give it a listen first, as we'll be starting right where part 1 left off. So, without further ado, here's a history of women's soccer, part 2. Despite huge audience turnout, the unofficial 1971 World Cup failed to garner enough lasting support to attract FIFA's attention. It did, however, result in the sport undergoing positive change in several countries. Like in England, where the English Football Association removed its ban on women's soccer. In 1975, a few years after France's participation, a women's league was reinstated in the country after years of its absence, this time with the backing of the French Football Association. Progress, of course, was not universal. In Denmark, the world champions felt that their back-to-back titles would surely birth an organized domestic women's league. However, their attempts were thwarted by the Danish Football Union, who told them that they could not just have a league on their own overnight, that they would have to earn it, proving they loved football as much as the men. For reference, the men's national team did not even qualify for a World Cup until 1986. The positive side of this story is that, despite the obstacles, Elite Division, the top-tier league of Danish women's soccer, was established in the mid-70s and consistently has had a season annually ever since. As Europe was beginning to experience a rise in organized women's leagues, teenage Mexican sensation Alicia Vargas, nicknamed La Pele after the legendary men's player, was met with a difficult decision following her performances in both cups. Wanting to grow the sport in her home country, but faced with a lack of a properly organized domestic league, she was given the option of an alternate route, a career in Europe. Met with offers of salaries upwards of $5,000 a year, around $32,000 in today's money, a good salary for women's soccer at the time, she rejected them all, choosing to stay and attempt to build a successful league at home. Things did not go as planned. As she says, "We thought the press would continue to give it a bit more attention and put it on television, but they didn't. After that World Cup, everything was over." Despite the lack of support, a number of women continued playing in the semi-pro circuit that had formed in the late 60s, with Vargas returning to represent Club Guadalajara, essentially in the same system that they had started a decade prior. Meanwhile, although still faced with a lack of international play, the growing domestic leagues, particularly in Europe and in Asia, where the Asian Ladies Football Confederation had recently formed, created a larger pool of talented players available to play for their country, should the opportunity arise. And it would, starting in the early 80s with a series of tournaments nicknamed the Mundialitos, Spanish for Little World Cup. Still organized without the sanction of FIFA, a total of 5 Mundialitos would take place throughout the decade, the first occurring in Japan in the summer of 1981. Throughout the Mundialitos, Japan, Belgium, the People's Republic of China, and the United States all made their debut in an international tournament. While not growing into a full, men's-sized World Cup, these Mundialitos finally drew the attention of FIFA, enough for the federation to sponsor a women's soccer event. Still hesitant to put together the big one, they opted to create a tournament with the direct intent of gauging the overall public interest in women's soccer. 12 nations, invited by FIFA, rather than qualifying through play, entered the 1988 FIFA Women's Invitational Tournament, held in the Guangdong province of China. Neither Denmark nor Mexico received an invitation, a telling sign of the fleeting praise Vargas had mentioned in the aftermath of '71. Brazil, however, was selected, as their ban on the sport had been lifted just a few years prior, and the men's team had created such a reputation for themselves, I'm sure it would have seemed blasphemous to leave them out. The Ivory Coast team got an invite, making history as the first African nation to participate in a cross-continental women's soccer tournament. Throughout their multiple appearances, the Americans had never managed to win at all, but their energetic and athletic performances had garnered some attention. FIFA, perhaps curious to take a chance on the newcomers, decided to give them an invite, while also booking a spot for Canada, who had specifically funded a women's program for this tournament. Team USA would narrowly escape the group stage round with 2 draws and a singular victory, only to be eliminated in the quarterfinals, to eventual champions Norway. Matches saw attendances in the 5 figures and more widespread media attention than the Mundialitos had ever garnered. Following Norway's final match victory against Sweden on June 12th, the response had clearly been positive enough as FIFA quickly announced they would be organizing the first ever Women's World Cup tournament. Given their successful precedent, China was granted hosting rights for the 1991 inaugural Women's World Cup. Of course, FIFA could not simply run things in the exact same ways they had with the men. Reluctant to brand the tournament with the, as they saw it, prestigious title of World Cup, the official name of the event was the First FIFA World Championship for Women's Football for the M&M's Cup, as the whole thing was sponsored by Mars Incorporated. Like the Men's Cup, every continent underwent their own qualifying competition, with a certain number of teams from each intercontinental tournament making it to the main event. Given the popularity of women's soccer in Europe and Asia, combined, they held 8 of the 12 slots for the tournament, leaving room for just one nation per every other continent, making their qualifiers a true win-or-go-home situation. As I mentioned, the United States had sort of come out of nowhere in the 80s and was already looked at as the front-runner for the sole representation for the North American continent. Mexico, on the other hand, had still yet to move their league beyond the semi-pro status and had not made a splash on the international scene since the 70s. Still, they managed to form a squad. Even after having lost some of her speed and athleticism, the now 37-year-old Alicia Vargas made the cut, earning a chance to participate in a new dawn of women's soccer. Unfortunately, by this point, the team was no longer considered the revelation they had been decades prior, and entered quite the underdog, especially as they drew the United States in the opening match of the entire qualifying tournament. There would be no David and Goliath moment. Quite the opposite, in fact. Famed American soccer icon Mia Hamm scored the opening goal just 8 minutes into the match, and the United States proceeded to attack with swift and forceful success. By the time the final whistle blew, the scoreboard read 12-0. The qualifying tournament would be the last international play of Vargas' career, as the United States would blow through the tournament without being scored on once. Averaging 9.8 goals per game and brushing Canada away in the final with a decisive 5-0 victory, the Americans were heading to China. Alicia Vargas would go on to have a successful career as a physical trainer, and while she was never able to play in a FIFA-sanctioned World Cup, she absolutely played in a tournament featuring some of the best female soccer players of her time. To this day, she's played in front of the 2 largest crowds in women's soccer's history. In 1999, Alicia La Pele Vargas was named the 3rd best player in CONCACAF history. In China, once the tournament was underway, the Cup's highlight was undeniably the athletic and explosive United States squad. Led by the attacking triple-edged sword of Captain April Neinrichs, Karen Jennings, and Michelle Akers-Stahl, the U.S. scored a whopping 25 goals in 6 matches, including their 2-1 final victory against Norway. Lacking the footwork and skills of several of the other teams whose nations had deep roots in the sport, the Americans introduced an aggressive and hustle-based style that has since come to define both the women's and men's sides, as well as a great majority of collegiate play. Speaking of which, let's talk about how and why the United States side was able to excel and grow, seemingly coming out of nowhere to take over the world, when nations like Mexico did not even qualify, and Denmark only managed to earn a single win before being eliminated in the group stage. Title IX is one of the most important documents in the history of education system equality in the United States. While the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was meant to protect people from several forms of discrimination in the workforce and public accommodation, it did not specify requirements within educational institutions. Spearheaded by the efforts of activists lobbying Congress to add sex as a protected category, Title IX was created as an attempt to do just that. While it is an anti-discrimination act as a whole, it tends to be best known for its effect on athletics, despite sports technically not being mentioned in the original document. The article simply requires gender equity when it comes to funding education programs of any kind. Still, the result was an extreme growth in women participating in athletics, both as children and at the collegiate level. Prior to 1972, less than 30,000 women participated in college athletics. By the 2010s, over 200,000 women were competing at the NCAA level. Title IX is far from perfect. Often, it is not fully implemented and has received criticism for certain specific clauses. But I think that, as a whole, it's safe to say its creation was a positive and necessary impact on gender and sex-based equity. Because colleges were now required to fund women's athletics, women were granted more opportunities, and because of this, got better. When the Americans first started participating at the national level in the mid-'80s, national head coach Anson Dorrance actually opted out of going with a predominantly college-age squad, instead going with a younger, teenage majority team, including rising talents Mia Hamm, Julie Foudy, and Christine Lilly. So, while the United States lacked a deep soccer culture, by the first World Cup, many of the players had been teammates for years. Still coached by Dorrance, who is credited by some for helping define the national team's aggressive style and establishing a family-oriented mindset, the through line created unsurpassed cohesion and team identity. While Dorrance left the national squad in 1994, he remains the University of North Carolina women's head coach to this day, and was a part of the Tar Heel squad that won 8 Division I tournament titles throughout the 90s, their dominance becoming one of the early spotlights on the sport in the United States, arguably becoming a significant influence in growth at the collegiate level. Because, despite Dorrance choosing younger players to form the early American national squads, he ended up being a part of the generation of coaches and players who took NCAA play to another level. I should mention that, in the mid-2000s, he faced lawsuits regarding sexual harassment claims and eventually settled out of court, so I don't mean to put him on too high of a pedestal, but this era of women's soccer is hard to talk about without his name frequently coming up. The biggest story of this time is how many more women were playing college athletics, with soccer quickly considered to feature some of the highest levels of quality and talent of all women's college sports. Beyond North Carolina's program, Division I women's soccer was growing across the country. Teams like Notre Dame, UCLA, and the University of Portland were establishing exciting programs that continue to have high-quality reputations to this day. In fact, in 1999, when Mexico qualified for its first ever FIFA Women's World Cup, a large amount of the squad were in fact women with Mexican heritage playing collegiate soccer in the United States, a fact that caused some controversy. Critics drew attention to the lack of funding and effort given to women's soccer in Mexico, facts which resulted in the lack of proper domestic scouting. Some Mexicans felt this squad did not even fully represent their nation. Their winless World Cup outing, ending in a 6-0 defeat courtesy of the Germans, eliminating them from the cup in my hometown of Portland, Oregon. Only further disappointment with Mexico's national team system. It's a complicated situation, and I certainly don't put any blame on the women who chose to represent the nation of their parents, but it did highlight the problem of extreme gender inequality in Mexico's athletics, an issue that, by the end of the 20th century, had gained enough traction to at least garner more widespread attention. All of this isn't to say that the U.S. have not had their own difficulties, or that they simply waltzed into stardom. Upon returning from their championship run back in the inaugural 1999 Cup, they were greeted by only a handful of U.S. soccer officials, a symbolic gesture of the imbalance in priority and funding between the women's program and the men's, which U.S. soccer was fueling with everything they had in the build-up to the U.S.-hosted 1994 Men's World Cup. In the months prior to the 1991 tournament, it was reported that after quitting their jobs to train full-time, members of the American women's national squad were only meagerly compensated, with several dealing with financial issues as a result of joining the team. After all, although American women's college soccer was beginning to prosper, a professional league had yet to be established. This is because, while the government can regulate what goes on in the education system, it can't really say shit about privatized professional sports. Still, efforts were made to varying degrees of success. Nike hosted a series of women's soccer games throughout the mid-90s in efforts to highlight the sport. Multiple leagues were created in the United States in the latter half of the decade, but, following the success of the 1999 World Cup, were demoted to semi-professional status as American soccer officials swiftly created partnerships with businesses and wealthy donors to form the Women's United Soccer Association in attempts to capitalize on what appeared to be a meteoric rise in the sport's popularity. Nicknamed WUSA, this was meant to be the peak of professional women's soccer, with many of the best Americans from the '99 team entering the league, joined by some of the world's top internationals. But just 3 years in, following the end of the third season, WUSA was suspended, citing revenue losses of over $100 million. The support and hype the Americans had seen in the '99 Cup, while enthusiastic, the collective national soccer culture was still infantile, and without something like a World Cup taking place on home soil, it seems the passion for the sport had subsided. I think anyone who watches the Olympics can understand this. I don't know about everyone else, but for 2 weeks every 4 years, I become a dedicated curling fan, a swimming enthusiast, gymnastics aficionado. And then I go back to pretending like those sports don't even exist. As I mentioned in part 1 about the 1971 World Cup, the spectacle of the tournament drew people in, but long-standing support of the sport proved much harder to create. I'm not saying it's right or isn't fair that the Americans had achieved such a great accomplishment only for the sport to struggle in their home country for the years to come, but there's no denying this is a repeated pattern. While soccer as a whole is now much, much more popular in the United States than even in the early 2000s, I remember growing up, watching ESPN and seeing soccer highlights maybe once every other month, but come World Cup time, it became Soccer Central. 30 days of all the soccer action you could ask for, then back to business as usual. I bring these up just because I would feel like a hypocrite if I didn't acknowledge that I definitely turn my attention on and off very easily at times, and because of this, I can see how league organizers over-anticipated a widespread fan base. In the same way an early successful American college system allowed the team to burst onto the stage as a powerhouse, this lack of advancement at the professional level arguably stunted the team's growth for years to come. Although many players were able to have successful careers overseas, if you look at the 1999 and 2003 U.S. World Cup rosters, several squad members have gaps in their professional careers, or completely retired from club soccer altogether. This resulted in the worst period of women's American soccer history, which, for them, meant being ranked second in FIFA rankings, a system not based on specific tournament performances, but a cumulative rank based on all games played. They would underperform in the 2003 and 2007 World Cups, which for them meant 2 consecutive third-place finishes. Despite fairly successful showings, without the big prize, nationwide interest continued to diminish. Strangely enough, it was at this time that the first officially professional Mexican women's league was formed under the title Liga Mexicana de Fútbol Femenil. But, as was the case in the United States, it lacked the widespread media coverage and funding required to become a big market. Still, the league formation could be credited for arguably the international team's highest achievement, beating the United States in 2010, the first and only time this has happened to date. It's just interesting to me. This match and this period are clear proof of the ups and downs the growth of sport, especially for women, can be fraught with. While a new American league was established, simply called Women's Professional Soccer, it would fold after just 3 seasons, citing internal organizational issues which largely had to do with a lack of funding. This also coincided with the Americans experiencing arguably their most heartbreaking defeat in World Cup history, losing in the 2011 final to Japan in a penalty kick shootout. As was the case in previous rosters, several players from the squad either have gaps in their careers or, without a proper league at home, went to play in Europe. So here we are, about 10 years ago. The United States is without a league. Mexico, who in 2011 had managed to qualify for its second ever World Cup appearance, hadn't been able to win a single game in that tournament, and, with a continued lack of funding and media coverage, saw their professional league relegated to semi-pro status at this time. I know the more recent stuff has mostly focused on the United States and Mexico, and as I've mentioned, my interest in these countries is personal, but I don't want to entirely leave out the rest of the world from this period of time. Because, even as this part of the world struggled to grow the sport, I should note, in the same way the Americans had sparked interest with their previous cup titles, Japan's 2011 World Cup win created a surge of popularity in the Nadeshiko League, the top tier of women's pro soccer in the country, and remains one of the best Asian leagues to this day. Across the globe, Nigeria, Ghana, and Argentina were also experiencing growth in their domestic leagues, all of which are still in operation and considered some of the best in their respective continents to this day. Even with all this positive growth, the majority of competition was still in Europe, where many of the top women's teams often have direct associations with historically successful men's franchises, a fact that tends to lead to higher funding and salaries. For officials and players passionate about American soccer, this had to feel like an embarrassment. Soccer had its history in Europe, so it's not the best analogy, but with the talent the Americans possessed, it's almost like LeBron James, Steph Curry, and Kevin Durant having no NBA and being forced to play overseas. Eventually, a meeting of sorts was held by the United States Soccer Federation, featuring representatives from now defunct leagues, players, etc., to try and form a new plan on how to build a league with longevity. Ultimately, after months and months of dialogue, it was decided that they would start small, with 8 teams, and slowly grow a league as to try and avoid the financial struggles from previous attempts. In an effort to produce high-quality, intracontinental talent while also saving the new league money, the governing bodies of Mexican, Canadian, and American soccer all agreed to pay the salaries of players from their respective nations, meaning the league already had roughly 55 high-level players ready to play who would be split amongst the 8 teams as evenly and fairly as possible. Nike, who had funded some of the early international and domestic friendlies, would be the official sponsor and game ball creator. Simply named the National Women's Soccer League, or NWSL, competition kicked off on April 13, 2013, a match that would end in a 1-1 draw between FC Kansas and the Portland Thorns. I can't say I remember this exact game taking place, but I remember this time. It was exciting, especially living in Portland. Seeing Thorns merchandise and logos and posters pop up everywhere. Being in high school at the time, my 16-year-old boy self was further excited by the fact that of the American national players selected to join Portland was none other than superstar and, at the time, super crush, Alex Morgan. I even got to see them play in person early on. Portland, a place that has long held a deep passion for soccer, was pumped from the get-go, producing the highest attendance across the league for its first 7 seasons, only missing out on the 8th due to COVID restrictions. The fans have come out, and the team is not disappointed, with the Thorns being the only club in the league with multiple championships. With Portland being a place I know very well, I think it's worth taking a look at the city as a microcosm for how the world of women's soccer grows as a whole. The area has a deep history with the sport. English sailors supposedly brought soccer to the Pacific Northwest in the early 20th century, with the name Timbers, the city's current male professional team, being used as a soccer club name as early as the 1920s. In the 70s, when the country experienced a short-lived but big soccer boom, Portland was heavily involved, with the Timbers joining the long-defunct North American Soccer League. For fans of the sport, it's at this time that the Timbers formed their infamous rivalry with the Seattle Sounders that lives on to this day. Later, as soccer had increased in popularity amongst children, Portland, a decent-sized city not without plenty of green fields or plenty of wealthy parents, was a fantastic home for it. So you have this perfect storm for success, and then, in the way that national teams have inspired entire countries in the past, I really credit the Women's University of Portland program for building the city's soccer reputation. Having been the collegiate home to numerous national team players, their status as one of the country's top teams drew in formidably sized crowds. Because they're college games, tickets are cheap, meaning it can be very affordable for a whole family to watch a high-level soccer game. I grew up going to these, long before the Portland Thorns existed. It was awesome. They always did a great job of having activities for the kids before kickoff. Meanwhile, the college kids fans were out there, wearing kilts and banging on drums. The players were always so generous, giving autographs after the match. These kinds of events were really fun, and I think that they can be so impactful in reinforcing people's passions. Now, I'm not a woman, and I didn't go on to play college ball, so I can't say they inspired me in a direct connection to my soccer hopes, but it was inspiring simply as a fan, and I can only imagine what it meant to girls with dreams to someday be in their boots. The point I'm making is, it's not just like Portland became the most devout women's soccer fan base in the country overnight. Various efforts made by various people at various points in history all led to Portland being deemed Soccer City, USA. Since the inaugural season of the NWSL, the league has not had to have any suspensions or lockouts due to financial issues, with the end of last year's season only canceled as a result of COVID restrictions. While I believe Mexico's inclusion in the NWSL was a positive, by 2016, enough support and enough efforts had been made in Mexico to the point that a fully functional professional women's league was formed, this time with the support of Liga MX, the top men's league. In a somewhat similar situation to the relationship between the NBA and the WNBA, clubs in Mexico actually went a step further and enacted a policy in which each club with a men's team was required to have a women's squad as well. Initially, in wanting to grow the sport from within, the league only allowed Mexican-born players to participate. However, as they aim to increase talent and viewership, they have since allowed 6 foreign players per squad. Though still not considered one of the top leagues in the world, for being just a half-decade old, there is hope that this is just the beginning of a new era of women's soccer in the country. Meanwhile, the NWSL is considered one of the top women's soccer leagues in the world. Some claim it's the best, depending on who you ask. And while I think you can make that case, there's no denying it's not the best place if you're a player cashing in salary checks. Europe remains the best place on earth for both men and women to earn a living as a soccer player. The majority of the highest paid female players still play in Europe, where, although still hundreds of times less than the salaries of the highest paid men's players, are still earning roughly $500,000 per year. In the NWSL, many players do make similar salaries, with American International and New Jersey/New York Gotham FC player Carly Lloyd actually topping the list of highest paid female soccer players in the world, earning $518,000 in 2020. These wages are only possible due to a policy that allows the governing bodies of Canadian and American soccer to pay their international players higher wages. For those who don't represent either of those teams at the national level, NWSL salaries are capped at $50,000, with a minimum earning of $20,000. These numbers were announced in late 2019, bumping the maximum and minimum from $46,200 and $16,538 respectively. The timing shouldn't come as a surprise to followers of the women's U.S. team. After their 2011 World Cup final heartbreak, the American women, fueled again by a domestic league of their own, won back-to-back titles in 2015 and 2019. In both appearances, several players had been outward proponents of better opportunities in women's soccer, including the entire squad directly suing the United States Soccer Federation, citing less pay and poorer working conditions and treatment than the men. By the time the last World Cup rolled around, their efforts were clearly gaining traction from the masses, this no clearer than the crowd chanting "equal pay" following their 4th World Cup win, a viral moment that captured the attention of news media globally. The aforementioned lawsuit is still going through the legal process, but has landed some strong victories recently. While federal judge R. Gary Lausner rejected the equal pay portion of the lawsuit, he preserved the claims about unfair treatment, allowing the trial to proceed, and just last month, literally as I was finishing up my Part 1 episode on this topic, Judge Lausner approved a partial settlement, addressing problems directly related to unfair treatment, such as team flights, hotels, staffing, and venue selection and quality. The ruling did not address the equal pay portion, as he says this claim is invalid, citing the women being paid $34.1 million by U.S. Soccer from 2010 to 2018, compared to the men's $26.4 million. The women's team argues that the increased earnings were due to their far more successful campaigns within the time period, and that is the disagreement central to the part of the lawsuit the women's team is gearing up to challenge legally, having spent the last year hashing out the unequal treatment portion, before now focusing directly on equal pay. It does not seem that there will be a quick resolution, as there are several disputes to address. While both the men's and the women's squads operate within U.S. Soccer, they are represented by separate unions, meaning their respective collective bargaining agreements function on their own terms. In the women's system, the team contracts 16 players for the squad, who are paid for every national team game even if they are injured and do not play, and earn parental leave, while the remaining players on the team only receive pay for directly participating in games. The men operate on a strictly pay-to-play, meaning any injured players or ones who do not participate in a game for any reason miss out on pay. However, the men earn more per appearance. For earning a trip to the World Cup, each men's player will make $68,750, compared to the women's $37,500, with various bonuses then distributed based on performance. This results in different earnings between the two teams each year, which is why the women face complications in the lawsuit. For example, in 2018, the highest paid players within the U.S. Soccer Federation were all from the women's squad. That said, 2018 was the year the Men's Russia World Cup took place, a tournament that the men failed to qualify for. Had they been able to, and won even a couple matches, several men would have been among the highest earners of that year. Further complicating things, the women's team was actually presented with a pay-to-play option back in 2016 and rejected it in favor of a collective bargaining agreement that included the guaranteed contracts, referring to the 16 players who can earn this status. The counter-argument to this is, more often than not, men's national team players can very easily afford to miss a national team payday, as they tend to earn hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars annually in the club system. Because there is far less security and funding in women's professional soccer, many players felt they needed contracts to support players unable to participate. After failing to negotiate a deal involving pay-to-play and a form of severance and security, the CBA was established, being the best they could get at this time. Unfortunately, this decision is what the U.S. cites as the women's team essentially rejecting a pay-to-play option, and now say that they have passed up on their opportunity of seeking this out. According to experts and those close to the case, it seems unlikely the women will win this lawsuit in court. However, there is some hope for them, in that the court concluded that the women made more than the men in this time period mentioned in the case. As I think, or at least I hope it's been evident, this claim is very weighted, and depending on how you look at it, has different answers. So, if the women can convince the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that the claim is in fact inaccurate, then perhaps the case can move forward. While we wait to see the outcome, there are several other issues within the sport that need to be addressed. Although the NWSL has increased minimum and maximum salaries recently, several players still struggle financially. Take Sydney Leroux, for example, part of the 2015 U.S. team's World Cup championship squad. She earned regular appearances for the team back then. However, as her career continued, she was dropped from the national squad, meaning she was no longer a part of the elite handful of players whose salaries are paid by U.S. Soccer and can exceed the $50,000 max salary cap. Leroux made headlines last year when she revealed she had paid more in childcare in 2019 than she had earned from her salary playing for NWSL club Orlando Pride. Compare this to her husband, soccer player Dom Dwyer, who earned $1.32 million playing for MLS club Orlando City SC. Now, to be clear, I don't think Leroux was trying to make her personal financial situation seem dire, but rather spotlight the challenges of being a professional female athlete. As she says, if you're not on the national team, you're sitting in the back seat. I think we need to make it more important, that it touches everybody. What we're doing is only affecting certain people, and I think that that's not good enough because we're losing out on really good athletes because you can't survive on an NWSL salary. People have different jobs. People's parents are helping them out, and that's not okay. This isn't a hobby. This is our livelihood. For people not married to another professional athlete, an NWSL salary often does not cut it. And look, I know, especially in the conversation of equal pay in sports, many arguments get thrown out. I've heard people make the argument that the women should be thankful as they earn far more than the men at the top of a sport less popular than soccer. I've also heard the argument of revenue, that because men's leagues earn more, it makes sense that the players earn more. The first of these arguments, I feel like, is nonsense, as comparing sports is apples to oranges. Plus, if the implication is that they feel the men in the other sports are underpaid, that's an issue with that sport, and not so much a way to discredit the struggles of female soccer players. The revenue argument is one that could seem to have some logic to it, and in some ways it does, but overall is fairly obtuse. While the NWSL and MLS do not release their annual revenues for the public, the NWSL sees about a third of the MLS's spectators annually, while their minimum salary is well less than a fourth of the MLS's. Further, men's leagues tend to have far more corporate sponsors and partners, who are often key in advertising and marketing, as well as just better funding to grow and operate a more successful league. There are so many challenges and inequality in the world of soccer. After everything I've mentioned, it doesn't even touch on problems with inequality of pay from FIFA itself, who gave out $400 million in prize earnings for players in the 2018 Men's World Cup, compared to the $30 million for the women in the 2019 World Cup. And this isn't just for the winners. This is the total money allocated that is distributed to each team based on performance. And yes, Obviously, revenue has a huge amount to do with this, considering the Men's World Cup is the most popular live event in human history, where during certain matches, literally 1 in 9 humans on the planet are tuning in live. But quite frankly, I think this is an excuse that will continue a cycle of a lack of support for women in the sport. As I discussed in part 1, so many times women showed that they had a passion for the sport, that they could bring in thousands of fans to matches, and receive no organized support. If companies and leagues had wanted to, I really believe they could have easily profited off of women's soccer years and years ago, had the efforts been made. Nonetheless, here we are. Despite ups and downs, delays in progress, women's soccer advances. Internationally, the sport is experiencing continued growth, with calls for better pay and treatment happening in various parts of the world. After just having become the first Caribbean nation to participate in a World Cup, the Jamaican women's national team, nicknamed the Reggae Girls, launched a social media campaign called No Pay, No Play, where they stated they would not play until they received their owed compensation. It would take just 3 weeks for their demands to be met, with the women quickly returning to play, now in the midst of preparing for the 2023 World Cup qualifying tournament. In September of last year, the Brazilian Football Confederation announced it would be paying men and women the same. This is a huge step for a country with a deep history of having skewed support for the men's side. If you remember from part 1, women's soccer was banned until 1979. England's Football Association followed this up later that week, making the same commitment. Australia, New Zealand, and Norway have too implemented policies resulting in equal pay in recent years. Back in 2017, after being fed up with the lack of progress, the Danish women's national team, also known as back-to-back world champions in the 70s, started boycotting their own matches. While the Danish Football Association seemed hesitant to negotiate at first, a partial agreement was made. The details were not made public, but it appears there are still ongoing disputes about pay disparity within the country. Still, it's good to see some of the nations with the oldest women's soccer history get some pay dues. In Mexico, while club competition and pay has improved, I found little in evidence showing that the Mexican Football Federation had any interest in reaching an equal pay agreement anytime soon. It's unfortunate that over 50 years after Mexican women drew in six-figure-sized crowds, they're still in this kind of position. One of my favorite photos ever is a bleach blonde 2-year-old me in my father's hometown, kicking the soccer ball around with my abuela. If your grandparents are from the States, I'm going to go out on a limb and say chances are you probably don't have this kind of photo. This show's called Fickle Future, and while I know I will never be the most catchy title creator, I feel that this episode really embodies this idea and what I'm trying to get across. In 1971, would anyone have guessed that the United States would be home to the best women's soccer program on earth? And do you think that people standing and cheering in the 71 World Cup final thought that in just a few decades, this seemingly iconic moment would be just a fleeting memory for most? The issue as a whole is grandly complex, and I know I only touched on certain periods, situations, and parts of the world. There's so much more I could have gotten into. Racism, which plagues the history of soccer. Several recent accounts actually spotlighted in men's leagues, but also affects women's soccer just the same on personal levels, as well as opportunities for certain nations and regions based on race and location. Issues surrounding gender roles often keep women from being able to fully pursue their passion of the sport. Maternity leaves and support from others in the sport has not always been great and has undoubtedly deterred many talented athletes from more successful careers. I think it's fair to call me somewhat of a sports fanatic, but for those uninterested in professional athletics, I can understand why all of this may seem unimportant. But I would propose stories such as the ones I've shared are far more connected to the issue of equality as a whole than is sometimes made clear. As Belén Sanz Luque, a representative of UN Women in Mexico, says, if we want to have societies where there is truly sustainable development, we must ensure that half of its population, women and girls, have the same opportunities in all sectors, including sport. Sport can be a powerful tool to empower girls and women and to eliminate gender stereotypes and to fulfill the 2030 Agenda, whose main goal is to achieve sustainable development without leaving anyone behind. The 2030 Agenda refers to a plan of action created in 2015, dedicated to ending extreme poverty, pursuing sustainable development, and giving all human beings the ability to fulfill their potential and dignity and equality in a healthy environment by the end of the decade. I know for some, supporting the world of athletics may seem like small potatoes in the grand scheme of striving for a better world. But my hope is not that focus turns away from other issues and instead is directed at bettering women's soccer, but that if we can progress on multiple fronts, sports equality will be representative of just how far we've come as a whole. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Fickle Future. Quick update about next week. I'm actually going to be on vacation in one of the most remote parts of the country, so I'm not sure how much internet service I'm going to be getting. I'm still planning on releasing an episode, but I'm setting kind of a timed release for it. So it should be dropping sometime next Thursday. If for some reason it doesn't come out, I'll be back on Sunday and I'll upload it then. All right. See you later. Bye.